Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We are now live with the Belize History Association for a conversation on enslavement and emancipation in Belize. And we are joined by the elected members of the Belize History Association Board of Directors, and they will be sharing their insights, their reflection, and the importance of commemorating this day in Belize. And then we will have special guest, Mr. Emerson Guild, who will be providing some remarks about the importance of the struggle that is ongoing through the UNIA and other initiatives in Belize and the region. We will then be taking questions from the Zoom meetings. Therefore, if you have any questions, please leave your questions in the chat. If you're on Facebook, please leave the questions in the comment section and we will be getting to those. Feel free to suggest future topics that you would like BHA Live to cover. And with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Abigail McKay, the chair of the Belize History Association. So Dr. McKay, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, my name's Abigail McKay, Dr. Abigail McKay. I'm so excited to start my third term as chair of the Belize History Association with a fierce passion to begin the important work of getting our Belizean history written, verbalized, and visualized by Belizeans for Belizeans. For too many decades, we have idly stood by, so others have constructed our story from their interpretation. Make no mistake, our experiences influence how we see, interpret, and express events and actions. I want to be sure we share links to our past that surely can guide and shape our future, especially considering that history repeats itself. For example, hair and clothing styles. Heck, even the COVID-19 pandemic, we can reach back into Belize's experience with the 1918 Spanish flu and learn some lessons from that time. Our story, yeah, that is what history is, our story. It is an important and interesting one to ourselves, to our region, and the world. Gosh, I thought nothing of it when I was learning civics and geography in primary school, or when I began studying world history in high school with Brenda Armstrong. Actually, I couldn't understand why we had to learn about Greeks and Romans at that time. Today, as I work as a human rights advocate and defender, I see the connections for that part of the world in the story toward a universal declaration of human rights. Injustice, wealth, and power mongering all contributed to enslavement of people as part of the spoils of the victorious. Victory didn't come just in the form of winning on the battlefield. It also came from other power-seeking spaces that led to enslavement of our ancestors. That, my Belizean sisters and brothers, is part of why I am interested in our story, the history of Belize. And Emancipation Day is especially important to each and every one of us calling ourselves Belizeans, whether we live within or without the borders of this wonderful piece of earth. UEF, the UBAD Education Foundation, led by the dedicated Yaya Marine Coleman, has spent the last 6 years raising the awareness through action on this most important day of recognition, remembrance, reflection, and redemption. August 1st, 2020, UEF will again lead an initiative in Belize City to acknowledge our ancestors who laid the unshakable foundation of the beloved country we call Belize. No matter where we are, we can all be a part of Emancipation Day 2020, in thought or in action, in spirit or in person. Just imagine, 40 days before the 40th anniversary of the Battle of St. George's Key, on August 1st, 1838, our enslaved ancestors were finally able to declare emancipated in prayer and songs at the Baptist Church at the corner of Queen Street and Jail Lane in Belize Town. Let us all commemorate Emancipation Day 2020. Emancipation, freedom, important then and important now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKay, for those remarks. It's certainly important to recognize the work that has been done over the years by so many different actors. Of course, those in the struggle themselves who had to fight for their humanity during the period of enslavement, who triggered sufficient actions to be taken for people to observe the cruelty that was ongoing in the Americas, in particular, through chattel slavery. I'd just like to remind our viewers, to those here on Zoom, to those on Facebook Live, of the period that we are referring to of enslavement, initiated in Belize with the earliest evidence of enslaved people by the start of the 1700s. By 1721, for sure, the records of persons being enslaved in what is now Belize. And starting from that period, we see an increase towards the end. By the 1790s, very large number of enslaved population. I'll share some of that information now. And this period that we are referring to as, there we go. This period that we're referring to, there's really a lot to unpack. There's a lot to discuss, a lot to learn, a lot to revisit. History is, as Dr. McKay mentioned, part of a story that must be retold, must be re-narrated, must be continuously analyzed on the basis of new evidence. We are looking here at a slide reflecting the percentage of enslaved persons during a period of years. Looking at 1745, we see that the enslaved population was close to 70% of the population at the time. Moving all the way up to 1832, here we begin to see a drop during this period. And this is also because the enslavement trade, or the unplanned enslavement trade, was already abolished by 1807. Therefore, it was a bit more challenging to see the inflows of new enslaved Africans into the settlement. But by and large, throughout the period of enslavement, you notice that the enslaved population were more than 50% of the population. And therefore, there was sort of strong contribution that people of African heritage, people of African descent, were forced to bear in labor. But there's also the other stories of their cultural contributions into what has now become Belize. I'll exit this now, and we'll like to just continue this conversation by now referring to the newly elected vice chair of the Belize History Association, and that's Ms. Ruby Reyes. I'll ask her to share some remarks about the importance of this day and the importance of discussing enslavement, discussing emancipation in Belize. Ruby, could you please go ahead?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, teachers who have tuned in and the wider Belizean public. Good afternoon to the other board members and to you, Rolando, for hosting this event. This afternoon, I'd just like to remark really on the impact of emancipation in the context of now. I spoke with my landlord this morning, talking to her about, what emancipation means for her. And in that discussion, she highlighted several issues that I think need to be shared. No, the first issue was the fact that she was not familiar with the date of emancipation, August 1st. That familiarization came as a result of her personal interactions with persons who are actually interested in emancipation and who have advocated for the day being celebrated as a national holiday in Belize. So she was working with such individuals, and so she learned the significance of the day. So what that highlighted for me was that there is much work that needs to be done in terms of making that connection with who we are as a people and who we were as a people. There is a disconnect between persons living in Belize now and the struggles and the experiences of persons who have who are descendants really of slaves. And because of that disconnect, we don't see the importance of Emancipation Day and its significance in terms of our liberation as a people. We think it's an abstract concept, really. Emancipation is an abstract concept because we believe we are privileged in experiencing liberation, you know, now as a people, being an independent nation. So we are unable to relate to the experiences of the enslaved. It's not taught in our schools as much as we would want it to. The critical discourse isn't really happening as much as we would want it to, which would ultimately lead to, you know, persons questioning. Last year, Professor Bell spoke about the need for more critical discourse through questioning. And I believe that emancipation really started from the point of questioning, looking at our current circumstances and situations and questioning, well, why is it that I am being treated differently? Why is it that I am facing all these injustices? Am I not your brother? Am I not your sister? How is it that I am being treated differently? So those are the questions that ultimately led to the many rebellions from the first enslaved person was brought to Belize. There were rebellions, and those rebellions continued and ultimately resulted in emancipation. Of course, the other factors, the political, you know, the economic, the religious factors, they are key as well. But, you know, the actions of the slaves were key. My point really is that the more we begin to question, the more we will see where we need to work more on the more we'll need to work on exercising our privileges, economic rights, political rights, social justice. You know, all of those will have a clear view of when we begin to question. And so for me, speaking with her this morning really helped to allow me to reflect on where I am as a person and how emancipation then has led to me being able to enjoy the privileges and the liberation that I am currently enjoying as a woman, as a Black woman, as a woman from the Forgotten District, as a Garifuna woman. There are multiple layers of and there were multiple layers of enslavement when you look at it holistically. So now I need to look at, okay, am I really emancipated? Am I really liberated? In many ways I am, but there are other ways in which I am not. So for me, Emancipation Day is really questioning our state and looking at, am I really liberated? Am I really free from the shackles that have that are oppressing me? And so that questioning approach is what will help us to continue the discourse of emancipation and really engage others in that discourse. So for me, it's really about questioning where I am and thinking about where I want to go for the future. So that's really what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Ruby, for that intervention. I certainly agree that there's a long road ahead. Emancipation as a process, emancipation as a means of interrogating the ways through which our actions have been limited as individuals, but also as society, and how do we move forward from this juncture, this new economic system that was forced upon us as a newly independent or dependent country. How do we move ahead? And we want to continue this discussion by looking or hearing rather from Frantz Smith, who is a elected senior member to the Belize History Association Board of Directors. And I must mention that all of these persons who are speaking today have multiple hats. They represent multiple organizations. They're persons who are in a struggle in different areas, in different battlefields, but ultimately with a vision to improve and see the betterment of society. Frantz, could you go ahead and share some remarks? If you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay, thanks, Rolando, and good afternoon, everybody. Hearing me? Yes. Well, I would just like to talk a little bit about my interpretation of this day. My personal interpretation, and basically is that the honoring of this day is basically for the empowerment of a greater number of Afro-Belizeans for greater progress, and the sad reality is that a lot of our people are still in positions, in situations that are not much different from a few years after emancipation, a couple hundred years ago, and we really need to address that. My personal way that I think I will contribute for the next part of my life is basically to try to address the basic needs of Belizean people. That there are a lot of basic needs that are even basically as low as our physiological needs that we aren't getting, that we aren't benefiting from this country that was given down to us. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do. My personal work in the next couple of years is basically about food. I think one of the things I will try to play a part of is to modernize food. Not only my personal food habits, but we also need to look at the commercial food that is consumed in Belize. That in the past, I remember listening to a talk by Dr. Io when he told us that one of the things that he had discovered is that the African people in Belize, they had this tradition of where they would grow the cocoa, the sweet potato, and dig holes in the ground and store it with ashes. But I think we need to modernize these traditions and come out very strong, because there is not a lot of economic. The economy is different from back then. That the African Belizean people they don't really have an industry for themselves, as like we see that tourism is down. No, that was a strong point, but we have no strong agricultural industry. And what I would want to contribute in is in the processing or the agro-processing I think that's a huge need in Belize. Yesterday, I was listening to the radio. I won't mention who said it because it will raise some exclamation marks. But yesterday, there's a person who mentioned that on the morning show that Belize has some raw materials that have, I think the words that he used is have incremental potential, right? And we need to find what these things are. We think we know some of them, but what he's pointing at, I think that is that there are some areas where the descendants of the people who were freed on August 1st, 1838, there is still opportunity for them. We should never give up hope, no? That there are still opportunities to own a piece of this country and to pass something down to the generation that we live. So finally, I would just like to mention again that on the TV the other day, on the internet, I mean, there was a conviction for enslavement in a Pacific country, and basically, this was like this week, and the story behind it was that this guy, he enslaved them. He was an immigrant to another country, and he enslaved some of his people, and they found him guilty. But I think that it points to the fact that this is still a problem in the whole world, and it will probably get even worse, no? Where is enslavement of the mind, which we know about, but there might be entire countries where you have economically weak people, right, who would end up being enslaved. And I think we really need to watch out that we aren't one of those, so that we can really do justice for our ancestors, no? So I will close off with a little poem that I wrote, and it's about Belize. And I'll see if I can share my screen. Okay, I can't share it, so I'll just read out the poem. So the name of the poem is Jewels. Nicholas hunting lime and rugged, for these I know we will be hurried. Jewels in a crown complete, our ancestors to us bequeath, with sacred words that her black soils we must plant then tend, so we can reap. And with our neighbors, friends, and foes, we wish to live in peace and love. But if not, to only thee we bow, great and loving God of heaven above. And just want to tell you a little bit about the poem. It's the first four words, Nicholas hunting lime and rugged, are the four most southern keys in Belize, no? And if you go to the archives, you will see some of the documents that there is a lot of significance with this whole the border dispute, no? Although the border is the land issue, these keys in the sea, they are important otherwise, no? So, well, thank you all for listening to my little poem. If anybody wants to see it, I'll try to post it up on my Facebook at some point. So thanks very much, Rolando.
Thank you, Frantz, for that intervention. We certainly agree that there's multi-dimensional analysis that needs to take place to understand the impact, to undo the impact of enslavement, thinking about it psychologically, socially, economically, from the sustenance, the things that we eat, to the way that we dress, to the way that we want to appear to others. These are some very profound ways of thinking about the impact of enslavement and how do we move on from here. You also mentioned the guest speaker for tomorrow's event, Dr. Anodolfo Joseph Io, who will also be participating in a Zoom discussion through the efforts organized by the UBAD Education Foundation, which Dr. McKay also signaled. I'll just like to quickly put this out there for those who are interested. This is available for tomorrow, Emancipation Day. There's a libation and drumming tomorrow morning from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Marine Parade. And this will be followed by a community talk at 10 a.m. on the Zoom platform. And you have the details on how to log in on this flyer. There's also a repeat of the program that will take place on CREM TV at 6 p.m. Therefore, we want to continue this discussion by now inviting Ms. Ifáṣínà Efunyemi, a senior member of the Belize History Association Board of Directors, to give her reflection and intervention about the need to recognize Emancipation Day, the need to continuously challenge the various forms of discrimination and oppression that exist in our world today. Ms. Ifáṣínà?
Good afternoon, Rolando. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone who is tuned in. I truly appreciate this opportunity to discuss this very important topic that certainly speaks to not just our past, but also our present, as emancipation continues to be something that we still need to reflect on and still need to be striving collectively and individually to achieve, both in terms of physical presence as well as our mental consciousness. I want to start my input in this discussion by sharing a poem titled Being Black and Garifuna. For being Africans, we crossed the seas from Africa voluntarily and involuntarily. We brought civilization to the indigenous peoples of the West. Before Ivan van Sertima exploded historical circles, they came before Columbus. Whites would have us believe that we only came to this side of the world as slaves at the bottom of ships. For being Africans, black like tar, bringers of civilization, advanced technology, pyramid building skills, and discoverers and workers of iron, we were revered by the indigenous. It is our blackness that made us dominate in St. Vincent, Urume, in a short time of being there. I strongly believe there was no shipwreck and that we won a revolt on those ships in 1635. Whichever way it went, it was our blackness, our being Africans, that made us survive. Our blackness made us admired, respected, feared, and dominant. Our blackness made us fight the British. And for our blackness, we were exiled. For our blackness, we were left on Balisau to die. For our blackness, we survived. For our blackness, we persevered. For our blackness, they could not annihilate us when they had committed genocide against all indigenous and black people. And what is the difference, really, between us, black and indigenous, when black people are the indigenous people of the earth? I share this poem because I see great value in us recognizing that our history does not begin, in fact, with slavery. It does not begin with the capture and the forced labor of our bodies, of our ancestors. It did not begin with us being subjugated to another set of people. It began with us being the first people. It began with us being the people that actually were the discoverers and who were the ones who achieved greatness. So in any discussion about slavery and emancipation, it is imperative for us to understand that as African descendants, that our history does not begin with that situation in which Europeans captured us and enslaved us. That is not the beginning of our story. And that must not be the end of our story either. And I feel that in order for us to be truly emancipated, especially as we look at the importance of mental emancipation, we must recognize that our condition was not one in which our ancestors were pleased and in which they settled for that condition. They were constantly fighting. And as I speak as a Garifuna, a descendant of a particular people who did not fight for emancipation after being enslaved, but actually fought for emancipation even before they could be enslaved. I descend from those people. And that understanding of my history fuels my interest, fuels my passion in speaking to my people and in learning about my history and retelling our story, so that that pride can be there, and so that that strength can be there, so that we can understand as Afro descendants that our story does not begin with Europe. It begins on the continent of Africa. And that is the one thing that connects all of us, so that when we hear of a Joseph Chatouillet, and when we hear of Toussaint, and when we hear about Harriet Tubman, and when we hear of Nane of the Maroons, that all of the peoples that we hear of in our history, they are all connected because they come from the same place. They come from the same history. They came from the same story. They came from the same source. And even though our ships might have gone in different directions, and so our circumstances might have been different, at the end of the day, we do have something in common that connects all of us. And that is, to me, the biggest breaker of chains, is for us to recognize our unity. Because the reason why many of us could not be kept in shackles was because consciously we did not see ourselves as a people that could be subjected to that condition permanently. And so there was always revolt, there was always resistance. These are some of the things in terms of historical facts that it is important for us to know and understand, because it would unite us, so that the strategies that have been used by Europeans to divide us and so shackle us, even if it is mentally, economically, politically, shackle us, those shackles could be removed if we understood and were truly liberated by our common knowledge of our common history. And our common history is a strong history. Our common history begins in Africa, in the south. It begins at the headwaters of the Nile. It begins where we discovered iron and where we were able to build cities. It begins with all those megalithic monuments that our ancestors built on the continent of Africa. And our knowing that and understanding that will help us to see what fueled those persons who were in fact placed in shackles, who were in fact placed on auction blocks and had to be working in mahogany camps under very harsh conditions, and whose names were taken from them and whose names were replaced with European names. How do we connect them to the people that did not have to wear shackles, did not end up working on plantations without payment and by force, but had to fight that same European people who were holding brothers and sisters in shackles in Belize? And we connect because we come from the continent of Africa. So even though Garinago were not enslaved and did not work for free in those shackles, we still were forced off our island. We were still brutally, they destroyed our plantations. That is one of the ways that they weakened us as a people. And they placed us on Baliso. Of all the Grenadines Islands, it is the desert one. It is the one where it's so difficult for one to survive. People cannot live. It has no fresh water source. It is a difficult place. It's cactus trees that you see flourishing on Baliso. So clearly, no cassava could be grown there, no plantain, no banana, right? And still, we were able to survive that experience. So coming to Belize later on, by 1802, as laborers coming and seeing our African brothers and sisters, the fear that we caused within the British was such that, first of all, they ensured that we were not anymore allowed in the settlement for an extended period of time, because they did not want us to be interacting with the enslaved population. Then they started their propaganda against us by speaking ill of us, by saying all kinds of lies about us and our spirituality, so that there would be a disconnect between these two African people, because they didn't want us to be fighting for freedom, which of course did happen. Many, many revolts had happened prior to 1802 and many more after 1802. By the time we get to 1838, there were many more Garinago here, and they were working in the mahogany plantations, mahogany camps, particularly here in the South. So there was always that connection. And despite that propaganda, there were many Garinago who were in collaboration with the other Afro-descendant group of Belize known as Creoles. And we work together, we build communities together, we strategize together. By the time you get to the labor movement, we continue to be working and fighting together. And today, because we have the issue of still freeing ourselves from that propaganda, from those lies, and lies that we still see perpetrated on television screens, and lies that we still hear about that have been written about, we now have to consciously come together and recognize the need for that emancipation. So the emancipation for me is learning our history and learning it truly, learning it from the perspective of our ancestors, learning it from the place of Africa, from the one place that we have in common with each other, that great place that is the birthplace of humanity and the birthplace of civilization. We need to understand that also, because after emancipation, one of the things that the British did was make sure that we couldn't own land, and they controlled our labor. They made the labor laws to be oppressive. And in 2020, to see that we still have those challenges to face as a people, it doesn't matter if you're Creole or Garifuna, you're still subjected to some of those same injustices that were already put in place at emancipation in 1838 at the end of the apprenticeship period. So those are the things that can liberate us, that we can really emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. We must understand the history from which we come and the things that we need to correct as a people so that we can rise back to our greatness, because greatness is where we come from. That is my contribution at this time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ifáṣínà Efunyemi, senior member on the Belize History Association Board of Directors. We're certainly grateful for your emphasis for us to remember that enslavement was as much, or perhaps more powerfully, an ideological system and not just a physical bondage that we must continue to address today. I'd like to encourage our viewers to continue sending in their questions, to put them in the chat. If you're here on Zoom, if you're on Facebook, place the questions in the comments. I'd like to just address one of them that Ms. Ifáṣínà has already in part begun to reply to, which is, the question is, who are some of the main actors who work towards emancipation? In classical education system, you would have been taught that the main actors were people like William Wilberforce and other advocates in the UK. However, I think that the response given in her intervention, Ms. Ifáṣínà pointed out Nani in Jamaica. You think about Joseph Chatouillet. You think about all the actors in the Haitian Revolution, which triggered, in fact, the need for Europeans to rethink the use of African enslaved labor in terms of their productivity, if they are resisting this very system in which they are being placed, and of course the work on, we think about, in the case of Belize, Will and Sharper, who are two names that are listed. The truth of the matter is that there are many actors, there are many people who contributed to the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery as a system. In many cases, their names are unknown to us because that was not important to the enslavers and to the colonial system that emerged. I'd like to now turn the spotlight over to one of the newest members to the Belize History Association Board of Directors. It's Jayleen Logan. She is a student at Ecumenical Junior College. She's being mentored by Ms. Ifáṣínà Efunyemi, and we therefore welcome her presence, and we are asking her and Karla Pinelo, who will be next, and also another junior member on the board, to share their vision and their reflection on the importance of history, of recognizing days such as Emancipation Day for national development. Jayleen, I'd like to turn it over to you if you could unmute yourself.
Good day, everyone. I'm a bit nervous, but I'll try to keep myself cool. So I'd like to start off from enslavement of Africans here in Belize. And they all started from, they were brought here in the 1720s to extract logwood, but then in 1856, there was a British scientist who or artificial dyes could have been made. So in the 1870s, the extraction of logwood continued to drop low. And so then Africans, when they were brought here in the Caribbean or also here in Belize, they were always resistant to British rule. And some ways that they resisted was by very famous marronage, which is when slaves would run away and find permanent settling in secluded areas of the country. And there are ladies like Peggy, where you learn about her sending a master to prison because of ill treatment. And so touching the topic of emancipation now as a Black young lady growing up, it is very significant to me to know that emancipation really means freedom, but freedom of what? To me, it is control. And it isn't only something physically, but also psychologically, because our ancestors were brainwashed and controlled mentally, and that's why the famous Bob Marley sings about free yourself from mental slavery. And so it is very significant to me to know where I stand as an individual, because some things that still happen in the past will affect us in this new generation. So to conquer this, I believe that we all must, like Ms. Ifáṣínà said, we all must learn more about our history, and not from the perspective of the European side, but from the perspective of our African ancestors. So that is my part that I will contribute for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayleen, for your intervention. Certainly, we appreciate those insights. There's a need for us to recall here a lot of the details that are too vast to mention, but certainly to point out the methods of resistance that African ancestors undertook is important to reflect on. It is important to think about the conditions under which they were faced. It was nothing easy, nothing even imaginable for us today to think of, and to recognize that there were many limitations that they were faced with, but nonetheless, they labored. The amount of logwood and mahogany that was exported from what has now become Belize was very vast. You know, the conditions under which they worked, and here I'd like to point out the conditions that women would have faced was also very brutal, distinct from what the men faced when they were in the camps. Majority of the women were the ones to remain in town, as to use the word town today, or what is now Belize City. And we have records from those cases of brutality. Some of them, as in the case of Peggy, that were taken to court, have allowed us to understand the extent to which the legal system supported the brutality of enslavement in what is now Belize. You can also read more about that on the ISCR niche Facebook page. There's a series there called the History Bites, and one could find some good insights into different aspects of our Belizean history. And encourage you to take a peek at that series called the History Bites, which is also available on the Belize History Association.org website. I'd like to now ask one of the other junior members on the Belize History Association, Karla Pinelo, to share some insights into the importance of this day.
Hello?
Hi, Karla. You can go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Okay, it seems that we're having a slight technical difficulty in accessing the live feed from Karla Pinelo, one of our junior member. We'll just take a pause there. We'd like to hear her intervention, perhaps when we end, right before we enter the question and answer segment. And therefore, I'd like to proceed with Mr. Emerson Guild, who is a member of the UNIA and UNIA ACL, and he'll tell us all the meaning of these acronyms and to tell us perhaps more closer to home as well what the UNIA has been doing to understand some of the struggles, the ongoing challenges that not just Belize faces, but the region and the world at large is faced with. Is important to reflect on a day like this. Mr. Emerson, please feel free to unmute yourself. Mr. Emerson, could you please unmute yourself? Okay, there you go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, for me, emancipation, a revolution, a revelation in July 31st, 2020. 2020 vision dictates that we look at what we're getting wrong and what it is that we understand that makes us get these things wrong. Each year on Emancipation Day, I find myself contemplating this word, emancipation. I would consider the origins of this word and its true meaning, because to me, this word is very abstract. It means, in its meaning, exists only in our thoughts, but has not manifested a physical, concrete existence in the lives of African descendants and people now declared emancipated. When we look at the origin of this word, we find that it comes from a Latin word, emancipetos, past participle of emancipo, which translates to declare a son free and independent of the father's power by the act of mancipatio and mansumiso, giving one's power and authority to another. To me, in my best understanding, that means to transfer ownership. Today, 31st July, as we do this exercise, I solemnly ask each one of us to consider deeply our own and do our own introspection on this word and the realities that we have been existing under for so long. 31st July, take a look at the act to abolish slavery throughout the British colonies. It was passed in 1833. The colonial masters put forward an emancipation plan to avoid drastic social changes in a 5-year period. Emancipation of slaves took place on August 1834. Immediately, there was a warning the warning that there will be a 5-year period of transition from slavery to freedom. It was called an apprenticeship. It would last until 1838. I asked, is this apprenticeship still in effect today? I ask you to consider that thought. Because of conditions that arises, we continue to demand our human rights to be respected. United Nations in its wisdom has convened the Durban Conference in 1997, and the ratification process has delivered the International Decade for People of African Descent. The decade 2015 to 2024 was proclaimed by the United States General Assembly in a resolution 68-237, adopted on 23rd December 2013. In proclaiming this decade, the General Assembly created a team, International Decade for People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice, and Development. In Belize, we have still not officially launched the International Decade for People of African Descent. Collectively, we African descendants in Belize have a responsibility to promote respect, protection, and fulfillment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We must promote and teach examples of greater knowledge, of respect for the diverse heritage, culture, and contributions of African descendant population in the development of Belize. 25 years ago, Belizeans, Guatemalans, Honduranians, Nicaraguans, Costa Ricans, Panamanians met in Dangriga and founded the Central American Black Organization as a vehicle to aid the African descendant populations in our region to adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks. This was to be done according to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action specified in the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and to ensure their use and effective implementation. We, the people, supported by government of Belize, should take these concrete and practical steps through the adoption and effective implementation of national and international legal frameworks, policies, and programs to combat racism,
Okay, it seems that we're having some technical difficulties there with the feed. Let's just see if Mr. Emerson will come on back. Just bear with us, please. Okay, it seems that we may have temporarily been disconnected from Mr. Emerson, and hopefully he will rejoin us very, very shortly. I felt that he was just getting to the good part of ending that narrative on how Cabo was formed, what their mandate was, and the ongoing struggles that they are faced with. Certainly, we are seeing what is happening in Honduras. We're seeing the level of activism that the Garifuna community is advocating for in Belize as well, and their need for these type of organizations that represent peoples of African descent to continue the much needed work that remains very urgent in Belize and in Latin America. As we await Mr. Guild to rejoin us, let me see if Karla Pinelo is available to take the spotlight. She does not seem to be available at this stage. Therefore, I'd like to transition into some of the questions during this time while we await Mr. Guild to rejoin us, perhaps. One of the other questions that we are being posed on Facebook states, and I'll probably ask Dr. Abigail McKay to share her insights on this question. It says, the Belize demographic has changed quite a lot. Mestizos are now the majority of our population. Do you see a further challenge in educating Belizeans about slavery in Belize, since the majority of Belizeans are non-descendants of the transatlantic slavery? If so, how, and is there any plan to address that issue? Thank you, Tiffany Molina, for this excellent question. Dr. McKay, could you share some insights into how we could unravel the ongoing changes in the demographic landscape of Belize, and how people of who may consider themselves in the first instance to be non-African descendants, how can they show solidarity? How can they seek to understand the importance of unraveling the impact of enslavement in Belize?
Thanks, Rolando. And to answer Ms. Molina's question, I think it is important for us to indeed do the history of the enslaved Africans who lived and died in Belize. Some of them left Belize, ran away, in fact, to neighboring parts of Guatemala and Mexico. I think it is important, as we have Central American migrants coming into Belize, and some South American migrants as well, it is important for us to look at all of our histories, because it is not possible to simply say that because my skin is brown and my hair is less tightly curled, that I am not of African, I don't have African ancestry. I think Ifáṣínà spoke to the history that is being told today of they came before Columbus, Ivan van Sertima's work. We have to look at how influences to the Mayan community happened pre-slavery. We have to look at during slavery, how people interacted, and I know ISCR is doing excellent work looking at connections of how people interacted in neighboring communities in the Petén area. And this is true all over. So one of the things we have to do as part of our history is to look to see what our foundation is built on. That is part of the mandate of the History Association, to write our history from all aspects. And part of it is our genealogy as well. We need to be looking at our family trees, our family histories, to see how we are connected, who we are connected to, who our grandparents are, our great-grandparents, etc., etc. Each of us, as we try to do that story, we're beginning to learn that we have ancestors from Honduras or Guatemala, or some of us went to Panama, and then there are connections in Panama or in Honduras, etc. Looking at our own personal lives is one aspect of what needs to go on, and that is a part of our history as well. But even more significantly, you cannot throw out the foundation on which this country was built. Every single person today, no matter what ethnic grouping we end up with, the actual way this country was built, why it was built, how it was built, is an important aspect that has to be known by everybody. So the history of Belize is important. And there's no doubt that it's the enslaved Africans and the Europeans who were there who helped shape Belize for what it is. 1797 is a record, June 1st. That decision by the people who lived here at the time, including Black people who made that decision to stay and defend this piece of land under the British Crown, is an important aspect of Belize. It is why we are called a bridge. That's important no matter who shows up, who's living here. So I think that there is a lot of important information that we must know: where we came from, how we were formed, why we were formed the way we were, no matter what the ethnic look is. And remember, you can identify on any census form whatever ethnicity you choose. So saying that we have 60% mestizo is not necessarily that. What is the mestizo? Where is the other connections, or et cetera, et cetera. So part of it is knowledge. If you know your history, you might know that, there's a connection there. My grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother or father was of African ancestry, and hence I have an African connection as well. I hope that answers some of Ms. Molina's queries.
Thank you, Dr. McKay. I think it does. It certainly helps for us to think about connections. There's a tendency also in the country now to say that we all mix up. And that phrase helps us to understand these connections, these multiple connections that some of us are yet to really unearth and explore by asking our grandparents, where did you come from? Or who was my great grandparent? Those type of questions may help to define or help you understand your family tree and how diverse it may have been. I'd like to on that point of connections, because I think that was where Mr. Gill was, the connections that Cabo was seeking to build at the time when they were founded, and the ongoing struggles that remain. Mr. Gill, can you please unmute yourself? Let me see. Okay, you can go ahead now and unmute yourself. Mr. Gill, could you please unmute yourself? It seems that we may have some ongoing technical challenges there. Nonetheless, we'll ask Mr. Let me see. Mr. Gill?
Yes?
Okay, go ahead.
Where do you want me to start from, please? I think, I don't know where I had dropped out.
You were about to finish the reading from the Cabo, I think their foundation.
Okay, 25 years ago, Belizeans, Guatemalans, Honduranians, Nicaraguans, Costa Ricans, Panamanians met in Belize because of a specific need. They founded the Central American Black Organization as a vehicle to aid the African descendant population in our region to adopt and strengthen national, regional, and international legal frameworks. This was to be done in accordance to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action specified in the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racism, Discrimination, and to ensure their full and effective implementation in each country. We the people, supported by governments in Belize, should take concrete practice and practical steps through the adoption and effective implementation of national and international legal frameworks, policies, and programs to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances faced by the African descendant populations, taking into account the particular situations surrounding women, young girls, young males in the following areas: their recognition, their justice, their development, and I have added a fourth, which is proactive violence. And I consider poverty, because it can be eliminated, proactive violence. We are our brother's keeper. We are the ones who must organize a step-by-step process to do the things that preserve our beliefs in humanity. We must return to our civic duties, raising awareness, broadcasting, any and all means, by any and all means, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is in place to guide us and our government when necessary in the full and effective implementation of national commitments under the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. We must do the underground research, collect statistical data, incorporate human rights into development of programs that honor and preserve historical intelligence, historical memory of all Belizean people, culture, and history. Please let me inform you now that Belize is lacking in our responsibility to the decade since our government has not officially launched the decade of African descendants, placing Belize behind in implementing the step-by-step measures to keep us in line with the process that has been initiated globally by the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who acts as coordinator for the decade, has established a forum to serve as a consultation mechanism and will be convening in 2020 an assessment of the decade. Belize, we're behind. We gotta get going. We must advocate now that the decade of African descent is launched respectfully by our government and by our lead organizations. And I gotta call our lead organizations out here, the National Creole Council and the National Garifuna Council, and any and all other speakers on the behalf of African descendants in Belize must step to the plate. If they don't, then we who are on this call must do so, especially the History Association. What is the legacy we will leave to our children? How do we show them that we honor the memory of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is what we have to consider. At this point, I would like to give the identification numbers where you can track the decade's progress reports that is happening globally. Pen and pencil, please. A/70339, A/71290, A/72323, A/73354, A/74308. These are the progress reports that can help to guide and show us where we are deficient here in Belize at this time. Now, as of July 31st, 2020, let's build unity now. None but ourselves can make the change happen in Belize. And we are the ones that must do what is necessary for true emancipation to happen. One God, one aim, one destiny. God bless Belize. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. Certainly we appreciate your intervention. You spoke to the need for us to analyze all the dynamics of enslavement, but more importantly, in this post-emancipation period, in this post-independence period, the post-colonial period, how do we build unity? And I think building unity is what is at the center of all of these organizations and why they exist. They exist because it is only through unity that these actions can lead to meaningful change. We appreciate that insight into Kabo's history and the ongoing challenges that they are faced and the ongoing struggles that must be fought by these different actors and by all citizens who value their civic freedom and value the need to continue ensuring that our future is protected, that our freedoms are safeguarded for the subsequent generation. Just before we take a few more questions and interventions, I'd like to make this opportunity to Karla Pinelo, a junior member on the Belize History Association, to give her insight into the ongoing discussion now. Karla, could you please unmute yourself?
Okay.
There you go.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. I would just like to add to what Dr. McKay had said earlier about Belize being so diverse, and we have so much mixed heritage that we may not even be aware of. But in fact, even if you don't believe that you have African heritage, I'm pretty sure that you have a friend or a neighbor who does. And so that should be enough to make you want to know these stories of emancipation in particular, because tomorrow we recognize the day of emancipation. I think that we were all affected by the transatlantic trade, and people of African descent are all over the place. It's not like they didn't have slavery in the rest of Central America, you know. It's just that these communities are only just starting to tell their own stories, and just like we are just starting to tell our own stories. And it's important because if there is no official recognition of emancipation, it's tied to this belief that we didn't really have slavery in Belize, which is inaccurate. But more importantly, these stories of enslavement and emancipation and what happened after, into the labor movements and all of this, these stories are important because we can learn from them. We can be inspired and motivated. Am I still there?
Thank you, Karla, for your intervention. Seems that we had some difficulties towards the end, but I think the point that you mentioned is well taken, that we all can share in valuing Emancipation Day as a day for national reflection, national observation. I think that is being echoed by all of the board of directors. Mr. Guild certainly emphasized that point, not just at the national, but at the regional and global level. At this time, I'd like to invite Mr. Nigel Incalada, who is the director at IACR Niche, to share his observations of the ongoing conversation on enslavement and emancipation in Belize. Mr. Nigel, could you go ahead?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Rolando. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Afternoon, members of the BHA. Congratulations on being the newly elected board. And certainly we thank you for your efforts. No? I wanted to respond specifically to the question by Ms. Molina on the question of demographics, how the demographic changes may affect the education on this issue of emancipation. And I know Dr. McKay has started to make contributions there. In that regard, one of the things I want to point out is that it is important to recall that the multicultural society in which we live, most of us are descendants persons who were part of this process of colonial rule. No? So we, whether we are Mestizo, Creole, Garifuna, Maya, and so on, we were all subject to the abuses. Certainly, our ancestors were, and we might even argue that today we are still, there's still a lingering effect, even within our democratic system of the abuses that would have originated in colonial times. But notwithstanding that, I wanted to point out that we were all part of that process. So the indigenous Maya, for example, experienced severe population decline at the time of European arrival. Enslaved persons were forcibly brought to the Americas. 20 million, 40 million, the numbers vary. The Maya Mestizo and the Castwar, East Indian people, the Garifuna people, if you look at all of us really, you realize that we're all part of the same process. So while ethnicity is important for us to understand where we came from, it is not so important though for the separation among ourselves, because the idea of separation is a sort of colonial comes out of that colonial legacy, and so we should use our heritage to celebrate where we came from and who we are, but never use it to divide ourselves, because for many reasons. You look at the United States, for example, and you see the ongoing difficulties there. You look at Belize and you see the issues of classism, colorism, where one person being lighter skin may be perceived to have more privilege than persons of darker skin. The separation of north side and south side, Belize City versus rural, out district versus Belize City, and so on. These kinds of things that are present in our reality today. But if we're not cognizant of its origin, we could also use it to perpetuate injustice on each other, no? And so it reminds me of that thing where there is injustice in any place is a threat to justice everywhere, no? And so I just wanted to drive home that point. I also wanted to comment on what Mr. Gill, who is, I understand it, the chair, the president of the UNIA chapter in Belize, they called for the action by the organizations in Belize, especially pertaining to the UN Decade of People of African Descent. I think it's high time, and we can see evidence of it now unfolding as we are speaking together, where our Black organizations should come together to talk about not only the heritage aspect of it, where we contribute to our country's cultural landscape and how proud of it we are, but also to begin to strategize together how is it that we affect the change or bring about the change that we need in terms of the social and economic, I think, which are very important, the economic inequality and disparities that exist in our country, everything about from access to land. How is it that we can ensure equitable distribution of land? How is it that we can ensure access to education? How is it that we can ensure freedom of expression in terms of how we speak and address issues in our country? Right. So these would be the things that I would like to make a call for all of us to begin to participate in, and not to be fearful, because part of the colonial system was we size up one another, no? We look at each other and say, look on one day they play a role, look on the next one they this, look on the next one they that. And whenever you hear that's the colonial mentality at work, no? But if we look at it differently and say, wow, that's impressive, that's pioneering, that's taking leadership, and some of you have taken leadership roles as activists and so on, and you should be commended for that. But what if we come together and try and look at what the strengths of each other, what are our strengths collectively, and how we can use those strengths to develop strategies for development, for our social and economic development. So I just wanted to leave with those general remarks. And also, emancipation then is a day, yes, in our history, but it is an ongoing process. Now, I think Emerson alluded to that earlier. It's a continuous process of acquiring freedom, maintaining freedom, sustaining that freedom, and being responsible for the generations to come now. So I just want to end with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Incalada, Director at IACR, for sharing that intervention. Certainly echoing the need for unity, the need for us to analyze the enslavement experience within the context of the imperial history that we're all a part of, the colonial history that we're all a part of across ethnicities in Belize today, and to understand how that colonial logic operated to divide us, to set us apart, and how now we must be the ones to unify our various communities, ethnic groups, to tackle the challenges that we face across ethnicities, across political choices, across class divisions, to see how we can move ahead as a society. I'd like to refer to some of the questions and answer questions that are popping up on Facebook and the comments that are popping up on the Zoom meeting. I'd like to read a few of them. Darlene Cancino question goes as this: Peggy and Kitty's history shows the abuse of women in slavery. Are there any documents available that you can share that give more specifics on sexual and physical abuse of women, of enslaved women in Belize? Marcy Raj asks, was there an event that took place in Belize in celebration of Emancipation Day in 1834, or did we not celebrate it? Tife Molina also asks, speaking about demographics, are there any strategy on engaging our youth population to learn and rewrite history and upholding the traditions? I'd like to briefly refer these questions to one of the works that have been produced through IACR niche. Let me see if I can point to that window very quickly. And because just due to the time that we have, I'd like to point out that there is a short booklet called A History of Slavery and Emancipation in Belize. This was published in 2011 through IACR niche. And here our audience will be able to find much more details into the timeline of enslavement in Belize. Some of the record of the celebration that took place on August 1st, 1838. You'd find some of the instances of the conditions that women and men face, the resistance, the type of occupations that were assigned to the enslaved. You'd find more details about the abolition of slavery. Again, some of the statistics that we are sharing. Certainly the case of Peggy and Kitty are the most famous ones, and there's ongoing research, there's ongoing records that needs to be revisited at the Belize Archives and Record Service. And with that said too, I'd like to mention, that the Belize Archives and Record Service is a ex officio member of the Belize History Association, as is the Ministry of Education, as is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the reason for that is precisely for what Mr. Nigel has pointed out, that need for unity, that need for us to have a strategic vision on how we could improve and expand the knowledge of history. The written records needs to be reinterpreted and analyzed. I'd like to quickly allow Dr. McKay to reply to the last question on the need to encourage young people to be part of this process. Dr. McKay?
That's a very welcome question, asking for how young people can participate in rewriting history. The mandate of the History Association is in fact to get our history written by Belizeans, and history meaning absolutely every aspect of our lives and our livelihoods. One history has to be the history of political independence. A number of young people were around in 1980. They were a part of the march, a part of the protest that led up to political independence. And if you stop and pay attention to that, that's a 40-year trajectory. We're coming up to 40 years. That's a piece of our history. The history of television in Belize started around 1980 as well. And look how it has blown up, manifested itself. The history of the telephone, the use of it. Every aspect of Belizean life is something that needs to be reinterpreted. I like your words, Rolando, that we have these documents, but they were written by those persons who chose to interpret it in a way that showed them in the best light, not necessarily the light of others. So it is important for us as Belizeans to write our history. When did we start with human services? How did Hattie Hurricane impact or devastate our country? So much so that we had Belizeans as refugees moving to other countries to live. And what happened as a result of that? How did we rebuild? How did we come about to a Hattieville, to a Silkgrass, to a Georgetown? There is just so many areas. Individuals can choose what moves them most passionately, and the history could be written from that perspective. And so I actually welcome, we're looking forward to young people, especially those at the history program at the University of Belize, like yourself, a graduate from that program, Rolanda. We're looking forward to the young people who will want to ask the questions and get the answers to them. That is what we are about at the History Association. So come on down, let us know. Everybody who's interested with any topic, any. Some of you may have heard about the Big C, the Rose Garden, and that's all I will say about it. Any aspect of our lives has a history. We should be writing these histories. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does, Dr. McKay. We certainly encourage young people to take an interest in history as a profession, as a hobby for those that are interested in that, to uncover our history. There's a lot to explore, there's a lot to define, there's a lot to revisit. I'd like to turn this time over now to the Vice Chair once again to share some insights into this ongoing discussion. I think she has some important observations to make. Okay, Ruby, you just need to unmute yourself. 1 second. You can go ahead now and unmute yourself.
All right, thank you, Rolando. And I'd just like to add that in response to the question about how do we mediate between the slavery that exists, right, comparing and contrasting the transatlantic slave trade rooted in the racial divide in order to tell the whole story and the lessons derived from it. I think slavery is something that's found, you know, from the beginning of civilization, I would say. All civilizations really had slavery. And I think when comparing and contrasting, you really have to look at the dynamics of slavery that existed within these, you know, different societies. Definitely the slavery that was introduced to the Americas was significantly different from the slavery that existed within indigenous communities at that time, and also in Africa, in parts of Africa. Chattel slavery really deprived you of all your rights, and that was what existed. I know in some African societies, there was upward social mobility that could have happened, you know, from works that you did. There was opportunities for manumission and for you to be freed based on, you know, your works. So it was very different. With chattel slavery, you were born a slave, you died a slave. There was no way for you to become free unless maybe your slave owner was generous enough to, you know, free you after maybe so many years when you're no longer economically useful to them. So I just wanted to mention that because Emancipation Day is about liberation, it is of great significance to every single ethnic group. We're all striving for our liberties, whether they be religious liberties, whether they're social liberties, political liberties. There are still a lot of oppression in our different communities and in our societies, and we don't want to perpetuate that oppression by saying that, you know, Emancipation Day is exclusively for those persons with African ancestry. Emancipation is of significance to anyone who has been oppressed. So that's the commonality. So I just wanted to share that. And as it relates to young people being involved, I think working at the Ministry of Education, we have really looked at that gap and have been trying to fill that gap. Belizean Studies is an awesome initiative by the Ministry of Education to really define what it means to be Belizean. And in defining what it means to be Belizean, I have to look at the stories of my Belizean brothers and sisters, because like Ifáṣínà mentioned, there are commonalities there in our struggles. And as it relates to students being involved and getting them to document history, I think that's where the onus comes on us as the ministry and on teachers to really start that process and to, you know, be the ones to drive that happening. And I would just like to share what I have here. This is a poster that was done. I mean, this isn't directly linked to the Emancipation Day in terms of slavery, but it does link to what I am talking about as it relates to liberation. And this is a painting that was done by students about the caste war of Yucatan. And this is a documentation. This is how students, you know, express their interest and what they have learned about these different events. For us as historians, we document using script. Students might document using TikTok or Facebook, you know. So there are different ways in which students can document, and I would like to highlight a former student from St. Catherine Academy, Miss Dominique Morales, who has really done an excellent job, you know, making these commentaries on different events that are happening and have happened, you know, in Belize. And I think we need to continue to encourage those type of discourse. And I must commend the Amandala newspaper for, you know, elevating her in terms of allowing her to, you know, share her ideas on other platforms. So I think that's where we can continue to engage our students and continue to engage the wider public as well. And we have a responsibility to really show them that this is of relevance to you as well. It might not be direct, but, you know, when you go back and you really look at the bigger picture, you realize that, you know, this is something that's true to me too. Emancipation, these are people of African descent fighting for their rights and their liberties. How free am I? You know, where do I find myself in the struggles of others? So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby, for the excellent addition to the conversation. Certainly there's a lot of resources that are out there There are a lot of people who are continuing this work to ensure that the public is well engaged, and there's always need for more. Therefore, we are encouraging persons to stay tuned, to join the Belize History Association. There is a webpage where you can sign up. I'm receiving some message on the Facebook page on asking how they could register as a member. There is a membership tab on the Belize History Association page. As you can see, you can fill in your details. They ask what do you consider to be your strongest skills, because we would like to see engaged members. As our chair, Dr. McKay, likes to say, all Belizeans are members by default of the organization. But what we need and desire are active members. Therefore, we encourage you to log on the Belize History Association.org page and to sign up to become an active member of the organization. Friends, members of the BHA, we are coming to the end of this conversation. I'd like to also ask that if you have any ideas about what topic the next BHA Live should center on, to please drop them into the comments, drop them in the chat bar. Let us hear from you. Let us hear from where you joined us today, which community. We'd like to know that. We'd like to receive any questions that we can answer in a future BHA Live. I'd like to share another few upcoming events. Yesterday was July 30th, and that marked the anniversary of the celebration, or the recognition rather, of the caste war. And on Monday, there will also be a webinar hosted by the Northern Maya Association of Belize, and that will be streamed on Facebook. Therefore, we encourage you to stay tuned for Monday, August 3rd at 7 p.m. Dr. Angel Cal and Licenciado Mario Baltasar Colicoli will be delivering each be delivering a discussion on the origin and impacts of the caste war on Belize. Therefore, we encourage you to stay tuned to that. On Sunday, there's another event taking place in the north, and that's by the Uchan Muul Yashkash Community Museum in San Lazaro. And they're also celebrating the theme of the memories of the caste war, and persons are invited to participate, to attend the session at 1 p.m. on Sunday. Again, there's a reminder that tomorrow, Dr. Eo will be the main guest for the session hosted by UEF, delivering special remarks on the anniversary or the national commemoration of Emancipation Day in Belize. And wherever you are, we encourage you to pick up, view, or listen to some type of podcast, some type of webinar that could help inform you about the importance of the struggle that must go on, and the need for everybody to do history. It's not sufficient to just hear about history or listen to history, but we all need to do history. We are makers of history in our own way. There's also, I'm being reminded here that tomorrow there's also celebrations in the capital of Belmopan, and there's celebration of the anniversary of Belmopan on their 50 years of existence. Not necessarily as a capital, but the settlement of Belmopan following the Hurricane Ate. And there's exciting histories that are being shared on the Belmopan City Council Facebook page, where they are also acknowledging the work of elders in the community and allowing their stories to be told. So exciting things are happening in Belize this weekend in terms of history and the need to promote a better understanding of where we came from, to help guide where we are going ultimately. thank you so much again to all our members, to all our friends of the Belize History Association. Please drop your name in the comments. Let us know that you were here. Let us know if you enjoyed this discussion, if it gave you value. We'd love to hear from you. And we will be back again on BHA Live. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap up for today's session of BHA Live, conversation on enslavement and emancipation in Belize. Thank you to all our guests, to all our observers. We certainly had a really nice time and really insightful time on this discussion. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you, Rolando. I will not let any opportunity go by to say thank you to our young people, you and Felicia working behind the scenes, because what you do is not only represent ISCR, but you represent young people of Belize very well. In you, we know we have a safe future. Thank you for your role in putting this together and being the host of the session, and for your continued involvement and interest in Belize's history. We love our young people.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. McKay. You didn't know you have a vote of thanks on a Zoom meeting, but now you know. We are very happy to help. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our guests, to all our participants, and to the audience. Thank you so much.